to bring their kids to introduce them to Dr. Pablo. So I think that really speaks to the heart of who Rand is and what he represents. So I've always been proud of Rand the doctor. I'm very proud of Rand the U.S. Senator and the way he's run his campaign, that he's not afraid. If you've watched the debates, to be the one man standing there that is a voice against perpetual war and against some of the things that the other Republicans are talking about. So I'm incredibly proud of him as a candidate, as a senator, and mostly as a husband and father. Years ago, I told him, "You're brave and you inspire that in others." So I'd just like to introduce my husband, Rand Paul.
Thank you. I get to go to a few political barbecues in my time. It's starting to show a little bit, but I was at a barbecue the other day in Paducah, Kentucky, and the guy in front of me had 2 big plates of food. And I was like, "You're not going to live very long eating like that." He looked at me and he said, "Well, my granddad lived to be 105. And I said, "Your granddad didn't live to be 105 eating like that." And he said, "No, my granddad lived to be 105 by minding his own business." Sometimes I wish my government were just minding its own business and leaving me alone to practice medicine, leaving us alone in our businesses, leaving us alone in our families, leaving us alone in our church, just leaving us alone for the most part. I want a government that keeps the peace, defends the country, has domestic justice. Maybe we could build a few roads. I mean, I want a small government. I don't want a big government that does a lot. I want a government that leaves us alone to prosper. That's how we got to be the greatest, freest, richest nation ever. I want to get one little controversy out of the way, though. There's been a little bit of a controversy about Tom Brady. It had entered into our household all the way down in Kentucky. And this may be a different controversy than you're aware of. In my household, I come home from a long trip campaigning and I look up, and in my bedroom, on the shelf, on the dresser drawers, I'm looking at it from my bed, is a picture of my wife and Tom Brady. We were at the Kentucky Derby and she had her picture taken. And I said, "Well, that's okay. She can have her picture taken with him, but that's it." And then I get home and there's a picture in my bedroom of her with Tom Brady. I said, "It's got to go. It's got to go or I'm leaving." So the next thing I know, it's in the sunroom. So it's down in the sunroom for a while. We go out to dinner, we come home, and it's gone. All that's there is the frame. Now, we have a son who follows football, and I won't tell you his opinion, but for some reason, the picture was missing. Now, Kelly's a big fan of Tom Brady, so, you know, some of the family's a big fan. But the son, I'm not so sure. But we did get the picture back. We have matrimonial harmony, and I'm not going to give you my opinion on anything else to do with the Patriots. But I do believe that our government's grown too large. And if you want to see evidence of that, we borrow $1 million a minute. We have a $19 trillion debt. What does that mean? Are they just numbers? $19 trillion. Borrow $1 million a minute. We owe China $1 trillion. We owe Japan $1 trillion. We even owe Mexico money. We owe Mexico $100 million. For goodness sakes, what's wrong? I mean, we are the freest, richest, greatest country, and what's going on? Well, I think we've lost our way in many ways. And whose fault is it? Is it the Democrats' fault? Is it the Republicans' fault? It's both parties. Both parties have failed us. Both parties are spending us into oblivion because one side doesn't get money unless they promise money to the other side. The right wants money for one thing, the left wants money for something else, and they get together and everybody spends money and you get stuck with the bill. But there are ramifications to this. Economists say that we're losing 1 million jobs a year because of the burden of debt. You got to pay for it somehow. We can either tax you more, but this is sort of the rub in government. Everybody wants something from government, but nobody wants their taxes to go up. So instead we either borrow it or we make it. We have a printing press in Washington. And so as we print it up, though, what happens? It's sort of a form of theft. The theft is we steal a little bit of the value of your dollar. And here's the dirty little secret that Bernie won't tell you when he comes to town. When you offer people stuff for free, it's not really free. If you pay for the free stuff you want to give to people through printing more money, each unit of value loses its value and prices go up. So who gets hurt worst by rising prices? The same people Bernie wants to buy by giving them free stuff. So we offer free stuff and we say, you're going to have a better life because I'm going to give you something for free, but we pay for it by printing money. And then when you go to buy it and you think, oh, now I'm better off because I have, the government gave me a cell phone and the government gave me this. But then you find out, you know what, my food costs more. And everything in my life seems to cost more. And then when you look at the overall statistics of how good a job government's doing with poverty, it doesn't seem to be working. We've had poverty since the 60s. We've always had poverty. There's always been some degree of poverty. But we've had a war on poverty since the early 60s. But I think poverty's winning. We still have a great deal of poverty, but now we have a nation that's begun to have sort of this anvil we're dragging around. And so a once great nation is slowing down. The economy isn't growing like it once did. The jobs that you could have where you got out of high school or college and you had a job for a career, they don't seem to exist. We have a certain malaise among college students who say, oh my goodness, I've got all of these loans and I'm not so sure my job is going to pay for that. How did that occur? What do we do to fix it? It's not enough to bemoan the problems. We have to say, what went wrong? How do we fix it? Well, for starters, we have the highest taxes in the world. The corporate income tax is 35% in our country. It's the highest tax in the world. So if you're a company, where do you want to go? Where the taxes are lower. In Canada, the taxes just north of us are 15% for businesses. Burger King reincorporated in Canada last year. Pfizer is reincorporating in Ireland. They're merging and going to reincorporate there. The corporate income tax is 12%. Even in France and Germany and all these European countries that are much more socialized than we are, they've got a lower corporate tax. Money goes where it's welcome. Business goes where it's welcome. But how do we get to lower taxes in this country? You have to say you don't want everything for free and you don't want an enormous government if you're going to have lower taxes. If you don't, what will you have? Your government will continue to grow, but business will continue to leave, and it's going to be a problem. It's already beginning to be a problem. But what happens is we get both sides going back and forth, and they'll pitch to you class warfare. Bernie will tell you, we must tax those evil corporations because they're getting rich and they're getting all the money. But have any of you ever worked for a poor person? The thing is we're on the same side. If someone owns your company and you're 10,000th in line, you make money when the company makes money. If the company's no longer here, you don't have a job. So we have to consider whether or not we are all interconnected and whether or not something that helps the business owner also helps the employee. Our taxes are chasing business away. Our regulations are chasing business away. And then it's made worse by the fact that we have allowed our government now to operate by executive fiat. What does that mean? The president's just doing whatever he wants. The president has a Republican Congress and he can't pass legislation, so he's just writing executive orders. Well, our founding fathers would be horrified by this. And people say, well, there's gridlock. Nothing can get done. We've got to do something, so the president should just do it. The problem with that is it's not really consistent with our founding principles. Our founding principles were that it would be difficult to pass legislation, that you would have to achieve consensus. In fact, one of the philosophers that our founding fathers looked to was Montesquieu. And Montesquieu said about the checks and balances, he said, when the executive begins to legislate, a form of tyranny will ensue. Why? Because there's no check and balance. No one's stopping the president. The president's just writing laws. That's not what we intended. In fact, the founding fathers were very fearful of monarchy. They worried that the presidency could devolve into monarchy, and so they wanted to limit the power of the presidency. The same goes with regard to war. We have many brave young men like Phil who have served, and Kelly and I, one of the main charities we work on is actually building houses for our severely wounded veterans. But the thing is war is such an important decision. You know what the Founding Fathers did? They took it away from the president. The president's not allowed to initiate war. And yet it seems the president's always initiating war on both sides of the aisle. We had a war in Libya. People say, oh, it wasn't really war, it was kinetic action. That's a euphemism if I've ever heard it for war. But we were involved with bombing and toppling Gaddafi. And this is a big question. It's probably the most important question I consider of the presidential season. And we began to address it a little bit in the last debate. For the first time in a long time, and I don't think this is occurring at all on the Democrat side, although I have to say that I have to take medication for my stomach to watch the Democrat debate. And so I haven't watched that many. But on our side, we really had a debate about whether or not the idea of regime change is a good idea. What does regime change mean? It means that somehow people have gotten the notion that our foreign policy should be that we should be in charge of deciding who's in charge of different and various countries in the Middle East. We want to pick people who we think will do a better job. We have this proposition, or some people do, we have a proposition that if you topple Saddam Hussein, that Thomas Jefferson will be elected. I think that may be a naive notion, all right? So I disagreed with members of my party when we went to war in Iraq, because I felt like that if Saddam Hussein were toppled, we're not sure what comes after Saddam Hussein. And sure enough, there's still chaos. We're 14, 15 years out from the Iraq war. There was an ensuing civil war, and then there was sort of a peace. But the problem is that if you look at it in the grand scheme of things, Iran is also a potential enemy for us. At the very least, they're an adversary. Is Iran stronger or weaker with Hussein gone? They're stronger. Is Iraq grateful for the 5,000 young men and women, American young men and women who died to liberate them, and for the $1 trillion we spent there? Well, their gratitude has been expressed in a strange way. Their best ally is Iran. So Iraq and Iran are bosom buddies now. And who's their second best friend? Russia. So we liberated a country that is now looking to Iran and looking to Russia. And it's a country now that is completely and entirely dysfunctional and probably will never be a country again, if it ever was a country. Because you've had these factions in Iraq that have never liked each other. The Sunni and the Shiites have been fighting since, you know, they still remember the Battle of Karbala in like 832 AD. You know, people here are concerned with what Britney Spears is wearing or not wearing. All right? Over there, they're still mad about a massacre at a mosque in 832 AD. They've got a long memory over there of the history. But in the midst of the Sunnis and the Shiites hating each other, the government we were supporting in Baghdad kicked out all the Sunnis. So you have all these Sunni towns which are now occupied by ISIS. But they were previously occupied by garrisons of Shiites. They didn't like the Shiites. They don't like us. They're not ever going to accept a peace that comes from the outside. And so while ISIS is a menace, if you want ISIS to be defeated and you don't want them to slither off and a new formation of them come, it can't be Americans being the mayor of Tikrit. It can't be Shiites being the mayor of Tikrit. It has to be somebody from Tikrit. The people who defeat them, the people they look in the eye and eliminate ISIS have to be fellow Sunni Muslims. This is something we have to understand. But I think we also want a commander-in-chief who isn't reckless, who isn't, just gung-ho that war is the first resort, not the last resort. Think about what we've been hearing in the debates. We had a debate about a couple weeks ago, and they asked the businessman from New York, we don't want to get too specific, they asked him about the nuclear triad. The nuclear triad is that we have nuclear weapons that can be launched from land, from sea, and from air. It's not real complicated, but we have it. 3 forms of how we can have a defense. But it's never been thought of sort of like, we're going to be eager to use it. It's something that's been a deterrent, a mutual deterrent with the other superpowers that have nuclear weapons. But Trump didn't appear to even know what it was, but then when he became aware of what it was, do you know what his spokesman said the next week? She came on national TV, and he's yet to rebuke this. She said that yes, that our mistake is that we haven't been willing enough to use our nuclear arsenal. That should scare us to death that 30 or 40% of the Republican Party could be considering someone who is eager to use nuclear weapons as our leader. It should scare us to death. And meanwhile, there's been another debate. The other debate has been, and everybody wants to appear strong. Strength is that they will show you how strong they are by how eager they are to go to war. So they all were saying, Hillary Clinton on one side, Rubio, Bush, Fiorina, all of them, Christie, they're saying, we need a no-fly zone over there, and I will enforce a no-fly zone. And I was horrified because I was thinking of the implications of what a no-fly zone means. A no-fly zone means that you're going to shoot down the people who are flying in that zone. The problem is, in that no-fly zone, Russia already flies. Now, I'm not saying I'm excited or eager or that it's a good thing, but it already occurs. That's the way the world exists at this moment. Russia flies in that zone because Iran and Iraq invited them, and Syria invited them into that zone. Russia's also had a long-time base and a presence in Syria. So when you say there's going to be a no-fly zone, I thought I would at least shame them into realizing that we might have World War III if you were going to promise to shoot anybody down. And sure enough, I'm looking at Christie next to me, and he's like, absolutely, I'll shoot them down. I'll tell them I'll shoot them down. We have to think of the implications of having a leader who's eager to shoot down Russian planes. That doesn't mean we should be anybody's patsy or that we should be weak. Reagan was strong. Reagan believed in peace through strength, but Reagan also talked to the Russians. Carly Fiorina says she won't talk to the Russians. Well, that's ridiculous. In fact, the Russians, for as much as they do things that are distasteful, are probably part of the solution in Syria. You will not get a ceasefire in Syria unless you talk to the Russians. You probably, in all likelihood, if you make the precondition that Assad has to go, not get a ceasefire in Syria. And here's the complicated thing of the Syrian civil war. The Syrian civil war involves Assad on one side and Islamic radicals on the other side. Maybe some moderates mixed in there as well. But predominantly ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, radical Islamic forces on the one side. There are 2 million Christians that live in Syria. Who do they side with? To a person, they'll tell you, Assad. So the guy that McCain, Graham, Rubio, all of these people that are eager for war in the Middle East, they want to topple Assad. In fact, they want to bomb both sides. Now, I don't know. I just don't understand a theory where you bomb both sides of a war. But they want to bomb Assad, and they also want to bomb ISIS simultaneously. They want to make the sand glow. Well, what does that mean? What does carpet bombing mean? It means indiscriminate bombing. So the thing is do you think there'll be more or less terrorists when we're done making the sand glow? We'll kill quite a few, and the ones that slither off in our midst will raise another generation of terrorists. I'm not saying that we give up. We have to protect ourselves. We have to protect ourselves from those who want to come and visit. We have to protect from those who want to come and kill us. But we have to think through what we're doing in the Middle East. If there's one probably truism in the Middle East, it's that when we have toppled secular dictators, we've gotten chaos and the rise of radical Islam. With Gaddafi gone in Libya, there is a failed state. Our ambassador was killed. Our embassy was overrun. The jihadists swim in our swimming pool in Tripoli. I'm not kidding. They do. They swim in our swimming pool. There's a failed state, and a third of Libya is said to pledge allegiance now to ISIS. So are we better off or worse off with Gaddafi gone? Sometimes these civil wars, often these civil wars, there's variations of evil on both sides. I think we have to get away from this utopian notion that Thomas Jefferson's going to be elected in the Middle East. I think what happens is they've known despotism. They've known only despotism on one side or the other, and it is hopeful that someday they will know the freedom we know and democracy. But it's not going to come from the outside. It's going to have to come from them. And I don't think that we've been successful in trying to create some sort of democracy or utopia there. We need to be concerned with our interests and not some concern for making or trying to bring democratic perfection to the Middle East. It's also very expensive. When people ask me, whose fault is it with the debt? It frankly is both parties. Because on the one hand, you have Republicans who say, we want unlimited spending for the military. But they can't get it unless they compromise with the Democrats who want unlimited spending for domestic spending. So they both get together, and that's what just happened. We just had a $1.1 trillion spending bill with all of the spending crammed in it, 2,242 pages long, and nobody read it. It was done in the middle of the night. Clerks knew about it. Senior senators knew about it. Deals were made in the dead of night, but nobody had time to read it from the rank and file, and no rank and file had any influence on it, and no amendments were allowed. And as a consequence, we have given the power of the purse to President Obama, and we can do nothing to stop him. There will be discussion of trying to reverse executive orders. I'm part of trying to reverse the executive order that was announced today. But because the spending was passed in bulk for 1 year, he will not be stopped. That's my prediction. Because it would require Democrats to side with us. But if we were to use the power of the purse and let the spending expire, and then say to everyone, if you want to spend money on X, or you want to spend money on this new executive order, you come up with the 60 votes in the Senate to affirmatively pass the spending. But we're not doing that. We're not using our power at all, and so as a consequence, it washes forward. Whose fault is it? Republicans and Democrats, because they've all just decided, we want something, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine, and we spend the money. But as a consequence, we're borrowing $1 million a minute. I think we need to be very aware of where we are situated as a country. I think we need to be very aware of the consequences of continuing to borrow $1 million a minute. I think as we go forward, we have to understand what the founders intended for our country. We need to understand where our richness, where our greatness came from. We're the richest, greatest, most humanitarian country ever known in the history of man. In 2014 alone, we gave away privately, through charity, nearly $400 billion. That doesn't happen in Cuba because they don't make wealth. If you want to know why we won the Cold War, we didn't have a battle with Russia. We beat Russia, and we beat all of communism because the engine of capitalism defeated the engine of communism. Because we produced great wealth is why we were able to defeat the Soviet Union. If you don't know how wealth is created and you don't realize where wealth comes from, if we don't realize that it comes from freedom and small government, low taxes, less regulation, we're going to lose it. I think this is an important election in the sense that we need to understand that the problem's coming from both parties. We need to understand how foreign policy fits into debt. We need to understand that there can be no unlimited spending for anything, and that we are not stronger as a nation if we are trying to project power from bankruptcy court. I do think that the number one threat to our national security is our debt. I want a strong military. Like we said, Kelly's dad was in the Air Force for 20 years. My dad was in for 5 years. Her brother went to the Air Force Academy. She's got 3 in the Navy right now, her nephews. We are aware of what the military needs, and we want a strong military. But you don't have a strong military by simply saying, oh, we're going to spend $1 trillion more. We currently spend $600 billion in the military. Is it enough? We can debate that. But to put it in perspective, we spend as much on our military, $600 billion, as Russia, plus China, plus the next 8 countries. There was a Secretary of Navy under Reagan, John Lehman. He was the youngest Secretary of Navy, and he was an advocate of a bigger Navy. He advocated, and he was one of the spokesmen for Romney. And I agreed with what he said. We probably do have to modernize and enlarge, and we have to build more ships and have more capacity. But you know what? He said the way we pay for it, and Romney I don't think ever mentioned this, the way you pay for it is getting rid of bureaucracy at the Pentagon. He said there used to be 7 joint task forces, now there's 250. And so there's, like anything else, the military is like other government, too much bureaucracy grows. But he didn't say we just add on the cost. You got to find ways to conserve, even in the Pentagon's budget. I'm big on auditing the Fed. You got to also audit the Pentagon. Sometimes it takes a while to get things done in Washington. I've been working for 5 years to get a vote, which included sitting down with Harry Reid by the fire in his office 20 times. And that never worked, but I tried. But I finally am getting a vote. It's going to happen next Tuesday. And if you're interested in having the Fed audited, I think all of government needs to be audited, but we're going to try to get the Fed audited. If you're interested in it, call your senators in New Hampshire. If you're from Massachusetts, call your senators also. I don't think it's exactly clear where everybody stands on it, but they all need to be called. This passed in the House overwhelmingly in a bipartisan fashion. Every Republican and 100 Democrats voted for this in the House. But we're struggling in the Senate, and if it were held tomorrow, we'd probably lose. Because we have about 10 or 15 Republicans we're losing. We get about 3/4 of the Republicans. We don't have many Democrats signed on at all. But if people will call, I think we have a chance. And the Federal Reserve does need to be audited. They have enormous power, and we need to know what they're doing. As you make your decision, as we move forward in this primary, we're getting close, as you make your decision, you have to decide, are you happy with the status quo? Are you wanting someone who will just simply govern over the status quo? Do you think we can survive the status quo where we borrow $1 million a minute? My prediction is virtually everyone on the Republican side will continue the status quo. The Democrats as well. Because everybody has their sort of sacred cow that they want to spend money on, and they're not aware of the problem enough to say, we've got to turn, we've got to correct our ways. I want to be the candidate who will change the direction of the country. I want to be the candidate who will give you back your freedom, give you back your liberty, make government so small that it doesn't get in our way, so small you can barely see it, so small that what it does are the essential functions of our country, and that's to defend our country, preserve justice. That's who I want to be, and I hope you want to join that movement. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now we're happy to take some questions, as long as they're easy questions. Yes?
Yes, sir. In light of the relatively poor performance, what role do you perceive for the United Nations in maintaining world peace?
I'm not real excited about giving up sovereignty to international groups. I think if you don't like what I'm doing, you unelect me. If someone at the UN, you don't like what they're doing, you don't have a chance to unelect them. And so when we set up our country, we really didn't set up a country where we were supposed to give power to them. I'm not against having an international body where we have a body that is able to discuss, and we have a place of, worldwide diplomacy that comes together in one area. But I am concerned about giving up autonomy from us to them without it being approved by your Congress. I think that Congress needs to take more of an active role. We sort of outsource things. Sort of outsource it to the UN. The UN's going to take care of it, and I don't think they've done necessarily a great job. I'm also not a big believer in sort of UN wars. Korea was fought under the United Nations. I'm not sending any of our young men and women to fight with the UN emblem on their helmet. It's going to be an American flag or not at all.
You and the other candidates have had a protracted length of time in this campaign, which has required a lot of money to get a job that pays a few $100,000. Lots of corporations are supporting these campaigns and probably getting more than simply good favor. I'm afraid influence is being bought. The Canadian process, the British method, where do you stand on that?
I like the way you described it as a protracted process. I think my wife would agree with that. It's a protracted process, that's for sure. I think money is influencing government in a bad way. I think influence is being bought, and I think influence is being peddled in government. The first thing I would say on it is that the reason people purchase government is because government has too much power to affect your daily life. If you had a government like what the Founding Fathers envisioned that was very small, no one would want to buy it. No one would want to purchase politicians to get their way. If government wasn't involved in your business or involved in your daily life and did very little other than defend the country, people would actually be more interested in being a state representative than being a U.S. congressman. In fact, in the early days of the Republic, many people, it was much more esteemed to be in the state legislature, which I'll see from some of the state reps here, but than it was to be in the U.S. Congress. But I agree with you that money is, as the system exists, is overly influencing the situation, and people are bought and sold. We have had trouble figuring out how to fix it because we do also have respect for speech in our country. And so there's been the opposition of, can you restrict? Now, we allowed some campaign restrictions in the 70s, and they have been allowed to have some limits. But now people are going around the limits to all these other groups. What I would say is this, and I think this would pass the Supreme Court test. Some of the others have not passed. What I propose is that if you do business with government, that in the contract you sign to do business with government, there should be restrictions. So let's say I ask you to build $1 billion worth of tanks. That's a big contract. We may well need the tanks, or boats, or ships, or whatever we need. We may well need them, but that's an enormous amount of money, or $5 billion, or $10 billion, huge amount of money. I think voluntarily you should agree to a contract that says you will not lobby Congress and you will not contribute to Congress. Let's make it really highbrow. We're still going to need armaments, and we're going to spend lots of money on occasion for things, but let's don't have you have any influence over the process at all to come back and lobby for it. The only way it would work, though, politically, to ever pass something like that is big corporations do contracting, but big unions do a lot of work for government. If both big unions and big corporations had the same contractual thing. So if you're the union that has 20 million people working for the federal government or working for something, you would probably have to sign the same agreement that the union's not going to be giving contributions or lobbying as well. It has to be equal between union and business.
Since 1945, we have dismantled our maritime commerce. And today, flags carrying, ships carrying American flags are practically invisible. The commerce this country was built on has diminished appreciably because we're no longer a maritime nation. What would you do to turn that around, sir?
Well, help me out. What do you think the reason is for why we
Taxes.
Taxes on building ships?
Taxes on import, export, taxes on the ports, the greedy people who are working and changing the rules and changing the laws. It's rather obvious what's transpired.
I'm for a tax system that would be much lower and simpler than what we have. Currently, the corporate business tax is 35%. I would have 14.5%. I would also have 14.5% for individuals. It would be very simple. You'd fill it out on one card. We'd get rid of 70,000 pages of tax code, and that may well help in the maritime industry as well. I'm also for lowering the regulatory burden. No president should be allowed to just heap a regulation on an industry. It should have to go through Congress. In fact, I have legislation called the REINS Act, which would say if any president does it and it's going to affect the economy more than a certain amount, it has to come back and be passed by Congress. So I think there are things that we could do to bring it back. But there's also, when I get a question like that where I don't exactly know the exact answer for the maritime industry, I'm also open to saying, what do we do? You tell me. If you're the expert, we get you in an administration and we figure out what it is that we do. But if it's taxes and regulation that's a problem, I'm for lowering the burden on both. Young lady back here.
I saw Big Short recently, and
Say again, just a
I
second.
saw the movie The Big Short recently,
Okay.
the 2008 financial crisis. And when I walked out of that movie, my feeling was it was the lack of government oversight and the lack of government regulation that put us in that barrel. So when people complain about government oversight, I'm thinking the SEC was missing in action, Glass-Steagall was repealed, and these bankers on Wall Street who will tell you they're assuming the risk, so why should they be penalized? We were all left holding the bag. So, I mean, I want Dodd-Frank made stronger, not weaker. I don't want my tax dollars to be able to out the banking industry ever again.
I think there does need to be more oversight and more regulation, particularly of government banks, which I think were a big part of this. The Federal Reserve, I think, was the key progenitor of the chaos that we almost had and did in some ways have in 2008. If you look at what happened, it didn't just happen in 2007 and 8. It built for quite a while. So if you look at the average home price from the 1930s on, it does this. Then it gets to 2000 and it's doing this. 2003 it's doing this. 2005, 2007, it's going almost straight up. That's absurd. It never happens in capitalism. Never happens in unregulated free markets. Because what happens in capitalism is interest, which is the price of money, should fluctuate like the price of bread. And so it sends a signal. So if I'm building houses in Exeter, and there are 10 house builders in 2003, and then there are 20 of us in 2004, and then there are 30 of us in 2005, and everybody's building houses. Everybody's competing for the money to borrow to build houses and for homeowners to own them. What should happen to the price of the money? The price of the money should rise. And as the price of the money rises, interest rates rises, what should happen? Slows the economy down. This is the cycle of the economy that happens naturally under capitalism. Interest rates are the most important information that is disseminated throughout the entire economy. As a physician, I liken it to insulin. Interest rates are like insulin. When you eat a meal, your blood sugar rises and insulin rises after it and tamponades it, and you get a cyclical effect. In medicine, we call it homeostasis. It's maintenance of balance. That happens in capitalism. So when I look at this, it's an important debate. You might not agree with me, but it's an important debate. Was this too much government or too little government? Was this too much manipulation of government on interest rates or too little? Now, I would agree with you to a certain extent on like Glass-Steagall and things that allowed the reason I agree, though, is not just as a simple regulation, but that when you allow banks to do investment banking, but you tell the taxpayer that we're responsible for them being bailed out, that is a problem. The whole concept of too big to fail is a problem. It's still there. We passed Dodd-Frank, but it hasn't fixed the problem. But here's the counterintuitive part of Dodd-Frank. We added on a lot of regulations, and we said it was only going to be on the big banks. And everybody said, that's right, the big banks need it. We need to make sure they're safer so they don't fail and they don't drag us all down. The bank regulators are now applying the regulations to the big banks to the small bank. So if you have a small community bank in Exeter, they may be struggling with all the regulations, and it's more expensive for a single bank to comply with regulations than it is JP Morgan. So what happens? The big banks swoop in and buy the small banks, and all of a sudden with a problem that we were trying to fix, counterintuitively got worse. The big banks are still getting bigger. I think one thing we should do is do something like Glass-Steagall. I wouldn't do it the old way. What I would do is, if you have a big bank, I would tell you that we have taxpayer insurance. FDIC insures your deposits. What I would say is that we're going to insure your deposits, but we will only do it if you have a division of your bank. So you will only get it, and then maybe if you're a depositor at a big bank, you're going to say, well, if you don't have insurance, I'm not going to deposit with you. And they'll say, okay, I guess we're going to have to separate our banks. It's a way of doing Glass-Steagall, but I think there's a way of more strictly structuring it. There also needs to be a plan of bankruptcy for big banks. So when the big bank comes up tomorrow and everybody scares you to death, and here's the thing, the people say they have to bail out the big banks are the same people who didn't predict the big banks were going to have a problem. And the same people that didn't think it was a problem having zero interest rates for 10 years. And these same people tell you, oh, you've got to bail out the big bank, and here's the middle class, we get all stuck with the bill. But if you have a gas station in Exeter or a restaurant in Exeter and you go bankrupt, nobody's going to bail out you. So it's an unfair system. So it's complicated exactly what the answer is, but I do agree with you that some form, and I don't think we're there yet. I think something more has to be done about too big to fail. I think it still exists. The problem is some of our regulations, I think, have made the banks even bigger. Not on purpose, but as an inadvertent result of some of the regulations. But I do agree with you, more has to be done, and I'm still looking at it and trying to figure out with others if we can try to get something done about it. Yes?
Thought banks were more dangerous than standing armies. So give people the power to create money out of thin air and they control the world. How do you take that power away? Government issue of currency for debts, foreign and domestic?
Right. You know, originally when the Constitution was written, they said that it had to be of gold and silver. That's all they mentioned. They do mention it explicitly in the Constitution. We kind of got away from that, and we have a paper currency. For a while, the paper currency was exchangeable with gold and silver. And then for a while, we said, well, the currency is backed by the full faith and credit of the government. If you have an honest government that's not running a deficit, that can go on for a long time. As the government becomes less and less transparent and less honest with its books, it becomes more and more worrisome. The joke I have now is that once upon a time, your dollar was backed by gold. Now your dollar is backed by used car loans and bad home loans. There's some truth to this. In 2008, when we had this big crisis, the Fed bought $4 trillion worth of assets. And you're like, well, assets are good, right? Well, no, assets are like bad home loans. That's an asset. Some people argue that the price of houses or home mortgages that the Fed owns may not have been marked to market. They may not yet have gone to their bottom value. There is some danger that we still live in a real estate bubble. We've come back in many ways. People are building again. It seems to be more healthy. But we still have virtually zero interest rates, and we have all of this stuff the Fed owns. The Fed owns so much stuff, trillions and trillions of dollars, they're afraid to sell it. They're afraid to tank the real estate market again. They're afraid to sell it because then we know what its actual value is at that point in time. So I am with you. Some have argued that what we should allow is legalizing competition, other currencies. And I think there's a possibility some of that occurs over time. I don't know if I have the ultimate answer other than that I'm very concerned about the fiat currency that we have now and whether or not we live in somewhat of an illusion of wealth that could come crumbling down in a dramatic fashion, like what was about to happen in 2008. And in some ways, 2008, a lot of people still did suffer through that for several years. Yes?
Yeah, look at the Middle East, and we're getting a satanic spread of terrorism around the planet. The Saudis just celebrated the new year by executing the Shia, which could put us on the verge of world war. You mentioned this in your debate. Thank you for that, this question of Russia. You're the sponsor of the bill to declassify the 28 pages which talks about the Saudis. Can we put an end to this terrorism which they have been sponsoring? Will you do what Senator Gravel did with the Pentagon Papers and read these into the congressional record so we can stop the financing of terrorism?
What she's referring to is after 9/11, there was an inquiry by Congress. Bob Graham was a Democrat senator from Florida, and he led the inquiry. And he's got a great book. In fact, if you want to know what's in most of the 28 missing pages, his book, Intelligence Matters, was screened by the CIA and the government and everything, and he wrote a lot of stuff that he could find from public sources that he was allowed to reveal. But the bottom line in his book, he'll tell you that there was a link between Saudi Arabia and 9/11. Now, can it absolutely be proven that it was our government? There's a lot of suspicion. 16 of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. And see, this is important when we think about going back, and there was some financing that looked suspicious as well. But when we think about the Middle East, see, Saudi Arabia is ostensibly our ally. They've gotten rich off of us buying all their oil. But it's important we understand what's going on over there. The Syrian civil war, the government is allied with the Shiites. Assad is an Alawite, but they're allied with the Shiites, Iran and Iraq. The rebels are Sunni and are allied with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Sheikdoms. In this civil war, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the U.S. poured tons and tons of weapons, many of which wound up in the hands of ISIS. Saudi Arabia has now executed a Shiite cleric that was calling for, elections or overthrow, or whatever he was calling, but he had not committed terrorism. He was a protester in their country, and they executed him recently. And they have a Shiite minority within Saudi Arabia, but there is some danger of that erupting and overflowing. But what I would say as Commander-in-Chief is Saudi Arabia buys all kinds of arms from us. It has to be approved by the President who buys arms from us. I would only sell arms under people who are going to behave and do the right thing. I would have said you don't put arms into that civil war, and you don't put them in indiscriminately, and if you do, you don't get any more arms from us.
Stop it by bringing it publicly to the floor of the Congress right now, which
Yeah,
you can
I've
do.
introduced the legislation to bring it forward, but I would also suggest to people who want to know about the 28 missing pages where they blotted out everything, if you read Intelligence Matters, you'll get a lot of the gist of the 28 pages. I will continue to advocate for it. I'm probably not going to read it on the floor, but I will continue to advocate for a bill that does it. And I will tell you, read Intelligence Matters
now.
also, though, because Bob Graham went through a lot of what happened, and it is important to learn from the past. And the only other thing I'd say on 9/11 is what always made me mad as a citizen and still makes me mad as a senator, no one was ever fired. Not one person was ever fired. All right. Yes.
Actually, just on this same issue, I think can people hear me? Oh.
I think that's media. That's not going to project. Go ahead.
Just on the same issue, I think it should be put in very simple terms. Senator Bob Graham said very clearly that if the 28 pages had been released, then ISIS would not exist, that the people who ran 9/11 and murdered 3,000 of our citizens would not be running free today to continue the mass murderous policy they are purveying, as you see in the Middle East. That considered, what possible excuse could you make for not using your authority as a senator to read the 28 pages into the record? And you have the authority. We don't need a bill, which, as you admitted earlier, is not going to go anywhere because Harry Reid's not going to do anything.
Right.
You can read it into the record. And I tell you this, and I mean this with full respect, Senator, that every member of Congress who refuses to release this information, and in so doing to bring an end to this mass murder, which was responsible for our own citizens being killed and is threatening millions of people in the Middle East, every single one of those people who's killed by ISIS and who was killed by the Saudis on 9/11, their blood will be on your hands and on the hands of any member of Congress who refuses to release the truth.
I'm the wrong target because I'm actually your biggest ally. I'm the one that introduced the bill to repeal it, so I'm your wrong target. But
read it into the record.
Well, then you're not really listening because I'm not your target. I'm your ally. And if you don't know if you don't know who your friends are, you're not going to get anywhere. Let me finish. Let me finish. But the only other thing I would say with the Saudis, and this was a big thing, is and the reason why this is all important also is that our reaction to 9/11 was to ask all of you to give up some liberty. It was ask you to let us collect all your phone records and look at all of your private belongings and records in order to try to stop terrorism. But a lot of 9/11 was failure to do the stuff that normal CIA and FBI should be doing. Two of the people from Saudi Arabia lived in San Diego for a year with an FBI informant. With an FBI informant. We caught people trying to fly planes and not land them, also from Saudi Arabia, also from France. But the thing is that we didn't do any of that, and in the end we said, oh, well, nobody made any mistake. People made mistakes, but no one's going to be fired, but really the American people, you just have to give up your liberty and we'll be safe for the next time. It doesn't really work that way. I think we do need, and in some ways they say we don't have enough FBI agents, I'd hire more. But I probably wouldn't look at all your phone records and spend billions of dollars looking at all your phone records. If we need 500 more FBI agents, spend the money to do it. Let's have targeted investigations. The Sinaref boy, the brothers down in Boston, we were tipped off by the Russians. He flew back to Chechnya, and there were public sources that he was probably plotting something violent against our country. I'm a big advocacy of privacy, but if I'm the judge and you call me at midnight and tell me this, I'm a yes to look at his records. If you want to look at the people he called, I'm a yes. If any of them look suspicious, I'm a yes. But if you ask me, can we look at everybody's records in Boston, I'm a no. That's the difference. It's not that I'm against going after terrorists or looking after them individually. Let's do it specifically, but let's have more agents looking at specific threats and not get overwhelmed by all the data of all of us that really just confuses and overwhelms us with information. I got time for one or two more. Right back here.
First, I'd really like to thank you for coming to the town of Exeter, which is really refreshing considering last night's very uneventful visit by the Clintons. And, second of all, I know you talk a lot about this, but really, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the CISA information bill that was introduced into the Senate in October and was written into law by President Obama in December, and how you, as a primary opposition of bills or of the state of cybersecurity that we are in our nation, plans to have concrete plans to counter this kind of
question. Yeah, the question's about cybersecurity, and they passed the cybersecurity actually as part of the big spending bill. It finally got put into the big spending bill. That's your question? It's about the cybersecurity bill. My concern about collection of information is whether or not there's due process in the collection of your information. And with the sharing of information, I don't have a problem with sharing of information, but I do have a problem if the data that goes along with it has a lot of very personal information about individuals. I think that there is a way, and I think there already is a way of sharing information, that if there's a certain type of virus or worm that is being worked into code and there's a technique for doing that by all means people ought to share ways to combat that. And I think there are ways of doing it. One reason I don't trust the government with more of the information in the way that they set up the bill was that the government hadn't been very good at protecting information. You know, the Office of Personnel Management allowed access to 21 million names, including all my personal information, to a hacker, which means they're not doing a very good job protecting their own. Business is actually pretty good at it because they react very quickly and they're nimble, and they'll lose money if people steal their stuff. You know, Target had a problem, others have had a problem, but business is pretty nimble, and I think I trust business more than government with that nimble nature. But I do think there can be sharing of information, but I thought there was not enough safeguards in lack of privacy in the way the bill was put together. I got time for one more here.
Yeah, the Congress gives money to Planned Parenthood. Now, I understand Planned Parenthood donates money to Hillary's campaign. Do you have a problem with that?
A little. But it gets back a little bit to campaign finance reform. If they're getting government money, should they allowed to have any contributions? Maybe that should be part of, if you're going to take a government grant, you sign a line that says we're not going to make political contributions. Not just a limit, no political contributions. Now they would say the money is separated. The problem is it's really hard to separate and say, oh, none of this is going for abortion, this is going for this. They also tell you that 97% of their things that they do are not abortion. Well, but if you look at it in monetary terms, it's like 90% of what they do is abortion, because they're counting like, you know, a pregnancy strip or getting some birth control pills as a procedure in all of their vast numbers of things they do. If you look at surgical procedures they do, it's 100% of what they do is abortion. But what I would do, and it's a controversial issue, we may not agree on it, but I don't think government money should go to them at all. And you could defund them if you were willing to use the leverage of the purse. Our leadership in Washington says you can't defund them because you can't get to 60 votes. But that's not really true. Spending expires at the end of every year. That bill they passed in December, you let all spending expire. The second it all expires, now everything that you want spending for requires 60 votes affirmatively. So you can shift the balance simply by letting spending expire, holding your ground and saying we want government to open up as soon as possible. The last time we did it, even the Democrats said we got to pay our soldiers, we got to get the military the money to continue to exist in the federal country. Within 2 days they passed that. A couple days later people were like, well, we can't not pay people Social Security checks or Medicare. They passed that. But you know, when it comes to the more emotional stuff, you could say, all right, let's keep passing the stuff we agree on, then we'll get to the stuff we disagree on, and maybe it's going to take 60 votes to get to the disagreeable stuff. But it's also how you'd get rid of waste in government. We spent $43 million on a natural gas station in Afghanistan last year. You want somebody to go to jail for something, whoever got the money for that should probably be in jail. They say the estimated cost would be about $500,000 in our country. It costs $43 million. No one will ever use it. Do you think there are very few cars in Afghanistan, and there are no cars that run on natural gas? Imagine trying to have a business in Exeter and you're going to build a natural gas station. That may be part of the future sometime, but you built one right now. It's not going to, nobody's going to use it. But it'll go to waste. $43 million. They spent $800,000 in Afghanistan last year for a televised cricket league. They don't have televisions in Afghanistan, okay? And what business is it of ours to borrow money from China to send it to Afghanistan for a televised cricket league? We spent a couple $100,000 studying Japanese quail to see, I'm not kidding, to see if they're more sexually promiscuous on cocaine. I think we could just stipulate yes, you know? Thanks everybody for coming tonight. Thank you.